everyone. I'm De'Ara, the host of the All Kinds of Minds podcast. I represent Social Cipher, an edtech company that makes social and emotional learning games for neurodivergent students. The All Kinds of Mind podcast is all about sharing tips, strategies, and insights for the professionals who support neurodivergent youth. Today, we have a very special guest, Christina Cipriano. She's joining us today. She's the director of the Education Collaboratory at Yale, as well as an associate professor at the Yale Child Study Center. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to be here today.
Thank, thank you so much for the invitation. Glad to be here.
No problem. So, can you tell us a little bit about what you do at Yale and your connection to neurodivergence in education?
Absolutely. So, I'm an applied developmental and educational psychologist by training, and I have the honor of directing a lab called the Education Collaboratory, where we work to advance the science of learning and social and emotional development. And we do that through three pillars. The first pillar is the centering of marginalized students and educators in their experiences of social and emotional learning. And when I say marginalized, I'm talking about identity at the intersection of race, class, gender, sexuality, and disability. And actually, the whole first decade of my career was anchored in all of the students who had been othered within the school system, starting through and driving through the lens of disability. The other two areas of our work are regarding evidence synthesis. So, whose funds of knowledge are held up as evidence? How do we understand the what, why, how, for whom, under what conditions within the broader SEL landscape? And how do we support folks to make really meaningful decisions as they're thinking about ways in which they're investing in evidence-based science in social emotional learning? And then the last pillar is we do assessment builds. So we co-construct novel data points to help students, schools, and communities tell their implementation journeys, and we do so by providing meaningful and malleable data points so that they're discrete and democratize the data so kids engage with the assessments around emotion regulation, and then they get the data right back so they can be agents of change in helping to support their teachers and their broader school community with understanding, the diversity in the ways in which they're experiencing and navigating their world. So all that to be said, I come to the work as a prevention scientist by training, but I also am a first generation high school graduate and the mother of four beautiful children, three of whom are designated exceptional, two of whom are designated neurodivergent by the current assessments of the times. And so there's what I do for work, I really do view very much as a passion project that has found me, because it's also my lived experience in every day, from classrooms to our kitchen table, in the ways in which we kind of engage and understand and support inclusive environments for all children to thrive in.
That's so awesome.
Thank you.
It,
Thank you
it
so
sounds
much.
very tedious. It sounds like
There's a lot.
a lot of work, but it's
Yeah.
really impactful work. And I love
Hmm.
that it goes full circle, that, even when you're at home, you're still able to use things that you use in your profession and vice versa. So that's really cool.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
So we actually found you because you wrote an article for EdSurge about how public schools are failing neurodivergent learners. And so our audience is typically educators, school
Hmm.
administrators, district administrators. So can you tell us more about what you talked about in that article?
Absolutely. And I will say that that article foregrounded a book that I have coming out. So I've actually just written a book called Be Unapologetically Impatient, the mindset required to change the way we do things. And in the book, I step on the science that I present in that article around understanding the role that we can each play in engaging in meaningful conversation to live our love forward, to move our society forward in ways that are equitable and inclusive, and that we each can play a role in that as parents, as educators, as employers, as doctors, when we're helping to support all youth to have the opportunity to thrive. So all that being said, so the motivation behind the article that EdSarge published on my behalf was actually my daughter. I have four children, and so it was my daughter Eleanor, who's named in the book and who gives permission for me to speak about her experiences. And I tell a piece of the story of our experiences and journey to a diagnosis in her neurodivergence, and how the environment with which she was situated within was not meeting her needs, and in many ways it was mirroring what we're seeing nationwide around the ways in which special education and neurodivergence within special education is positioned, right? And so what I mean by that is there is a culture and climate within special ed of deficit framing, right? Even just the idea of, like, you may hear terms like learning difference, that there's something different or atypical, or all of these kind of clinical terminologies that come up that kind of suggest an othering in and of itself. And then on top of that, there is a culture within the school systems nationally around, kind of a waiting to fail model. This idea that in order to receive supports and inputs that may benefit students to, most optimally, maximize how they're able to learn in school, right, and what they're able to kind of engage with their peers, with the content, et cetera, that we kind of have to show that they aren't accessing it before we kind of intervene, right, within special education services. So it's like a much broader kind of landscape within that. And anyway, so in the article, I kind of share some pieces of our experience, and what our daughter was kind of going through in a context that wasn't quite designed with her in mind, nor setting her up to succeed, and rather waiting for her to fail in that regard. And so, my hope in writing that article, as well as in the book that's coming out, is to support folks with having critical conversations and recognition of the positionality that we each hold to affect change, so that we can evolve the status quo in meaningful ways for all kids to thrive in. And so, to make things kind of like a bit more concrete, I think it's very important that we acknowledge, when we think about neurodivergence and the ways in which kids are showing up, that there is diversity in how each and every one of us see and navigate our world, right? The ways in which we engage are wildly diverse at the intersections of disability, as well as other salient factors of our identities, right, and the context with which we're in. And recognition of that can be challenging, depending upon what school system you're in, what classroom you're in, how the teacher was trained. In the article, I mention briefly about how, odds are most educators take one class in, special education at large, broadly, fill in the blank. And so there's really kind of a lack of knowledge or awareness, and or kind of a distance between what the scientists know, or what, what's coming out in the latest research, and then what's being taught in pre-service and in-service education to best support us attending to the widest heterogeneity of learner, meaning that we're all variable in how we would benefit in a learning experience in school. And so improving pedagogies, so how we teach, being conscious of what we're teaching, the content, and the ways in which in classrooms across the country we have, we see this in our research. There's some shoulding or some suggesting of what good learning looks like, how students should feel. We have to be really careful. And in my book, I talk a lot about how we can all learn to recognize and hear that kind of framing, and pause and say, hey, wait a second, we've got an opportunity here to us begin to kind of unlearn and relearn a new way of recognizing the assets that every student brings to the classroom.
That sounds really interesting. And I'm actually a former teacher. And so when you brought up how, usually at like one class about special education and then that's
Mm-hmm.
it, that was 100% my experience.
Mm-hmm.
And where I'm at, you don't have to have a degree in education to teach. You just have to have your degree, and then you can do a preparation program after you've
Wow.
already started teaching. And so it wasn't
Okay.
until my second year of teaching that I learned anything about working with neurodivergent students. And I don't even think that term was being used at that time.
Mm-hmm.
So it was just
Yeah.
like, and everything was put into a category together. So we got
Yes.
maybe a chapter about autism, and
Right.
then we
Right.
had all the other different things. And so it's it really is a deep unlearning that has to happen. One, because um the stuff that's in the chapter is very deficit based,
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately. It's
Mm-hmm.
it's very much so. You can tell it's neurotypical people writing this based on their perspectives and
Mm-hmm.
stereotypes of
Yeah.
autistic people, or individuals with ADHD. So
Right.
there's that part, but also the part of, okay, I don't even know enough about this to form my own, perspective.
Mm-hmm.
I don't even know who to go to. So I love that you're really like tackling that subject and at
Yeah.
least awakening people to, what you were taught about this might not be the best.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I'm sorry to hear that was your experience. I'm not surprised to hear that was your experience. And again, this really is like I think about as a prevention scientist, I'm always anchoring in like what can we change? How can we
Hmm.
invest? And like what can we do early and often so that we shift trajectories? And when I think about the role of pre-service teacher education and our opportunities here to grow the educator workforce and build content knowledge and ways to help to support, and even an in-service education program. So all of the PD that's occurring, right, and ways to help to kind of bring people up to speed to acknowledge that as adults, right, our brain tricks us, right? It's really difficult for us to unlearn once we've created a certain schema of like the way I talk about this a lot in my book, like the way things should be. And so, when you are an educator and you've kind of fallen into your kind of norms and routines of practice, you become more habituated into how this is supposed to go, what you're supposed to do, and your students in front of you, they become a student or that student. And that's it's no any teacher's fault. That's our brain, right? Our brain, we kind of become inward leading. We create scripts on experiences based on what we teach and how we teach it and how we're seeing our students responding to it. And it takes intention and attention for us to disentangle that in education. And that's not something that is a 3 o'clock on Friday PD, right? We're talking about a lifelong journey of learning and unlearning and relearning so that we can make sure we're seeing students as they are and not who we may imagine them to be.
I love that. In our last episode, we spoke to a superintendent who's done a lot of work in this space, and he used the phrase the soft bigotry of low expectations to
Oof.
describe
Yeah.
what a lot of
Mm-hmm.
educators tend to have without knowing
Mm-hmm.
it. They love their students and everything, but
Mm-hmm.
those expectations just aren't as high as they have for their neurotypical students. And it's not based off
Mm-hmm.
of seeing that student's abilities, it's based off of a diagnosis and what
Yes.
they believe those expectations should be.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah,
um,
it's if I could just add one more kind of note on that, since you brought up
mhm,
the idea of the diagnosis, and in the book I talk about this as well. That it's kind of curious to me that when you kind of approach disability, neurodivergence from the medical model, it's all about like moving towards this diagnosis, and you get this diagnosis, and the idea behind that, right, is that that diagnosis opens up opportunity. It opens up access to care, to treatment, to care providers, different ways of intervening to support that child and that adolescent to thrive. And at the same time, that diagnosis, right, that designation, depending upon the school and learning context that you're in, that can be then used to excuse or other or exclude the same child that we were just saying that by having that diagnosis, it allows for the checking of certain boxes from a medical perspective to then allow access to or insurance coverage for XYZ. And so it's a really messy conundrum that we're in there when we think about the ways in which, and it's a salient part of a child and adolescent's identity is being treated and arrived at within the context that we live in, because we don't just have like our school self and ourself at the doctors or ourself at
mhm.
home. Like we are all the whole person in all contexts.
Right, right. Yeah, that's very true. So, in your work, you talk a lot about like ableism and how that impacts students. Can you explain more about what ableism is and how it and what it would look like in a school?
Yeah, so I think it's important for us to recognize that I take the perspective that most adults and most others around us may not realize they're being ableist when they are. So I enter the conversation from a perspective of like education, that we can show people, that we can educate them, that we can instruct them to understand and recognize that the way they may have learned of what is you know I can't even use the terms. This is how like entrenched I am in this, right? This idea of like what is normal or typical or expected, that there is a bias baked into that kind of framing. And so when we think about the way in which being ableist or the expectation of certain levels of ability as being kind of standard of all people, that shows up in what we may expect students to know, what we may expect students to demonstrate in any given array of tasks, and how they understand, process, the ways in which we expect them to kind of engage within our school systems, and then the ways in which we evaluate them there within. And so let me give you some concrete examples on this. So, you know, the expectation of extemporaneous speech in a classroom. So this idea of like classroom participation, that and you know, depending on where you are in the academic continuum, K-12 and then higher ed, right, there's this you know, participates well in class, or like what engagement looks like, and the, you know, jumping to raise your hand and answer the question, and right, this idea of like, you know, that is demonstration of strong content knowledge, and that is demonstration of like, you know, someone who's very engaged in their learning experience. Well, you know, the expectation of extemporaneous speech, it has all these assumptions baked into it that one could say are rather ableist, right? And so the expectation of executive functioning at a given level, of like social pragmatics, of, and we can go on and on and on, of like what's expected in that time, and how that is not, you know, not an equitable opportunity for all students in that classroom to demonstrate their learning. And like similarly, the expectation of, and I think I started to mention this before, you know, like what good learning looks like, what attention looks like. And you know, before we got on the video here, I was talking about how I was going to try really hard to not wiggle my chair, right? But that's you know, that helps me. But there's many spaces and places where that is not something that is prized or valued, and classrooms are, you know, kids legs down, hands on lap, quiet hands, calm hands. We hear all these different expressions and terms. Maybe you yourself, you know, we're educated in that way, or having kids sit on their hands, etc. Like those are not valuing or appreciating the diversity of what, you know, good learning can look like. And in fact, for many folks, you know, with and without neurodivergence, the ability to be able to kind of attend in the ways in which they're attending to, you know, moving their hands, moving their mind, moving their eyes, like eye contact itself can be an inhibiting factor of their attending, that if they need to focus their eyes up here, that they're actually not able to then fully process and you know, kind of hear the content to learn it, as opposed to if, you know, eye gaze was diverted elsewhere. So just a few kind of high level examples, but of how it can show up.
Thank you for those examples. It sounds like the disconnect happens when these expectations, or not expectations, but like certain behaviors are interpreted a certain way. So for example, raising your hand in class is interpreted as you're engaged, you are paying attention. And right, if somebody isn't doing that, it's like they're not paying attention, they're not engaged, they're bored, they don't know the information.
Right.
As opposed to really getting to know the students and figuring out, okay, if they're not raising their hand, it might be because they have social anxiety. But if you ask them to write out everything, they know yes, everything that you're talking about.
Exactly. Right.
And so it sounds like it really comes down to just getting to know your students, and
yeah,
and being open to these other mindsets and not being so stuck in your ways. And that's something that as a teacher I definitely noticed, just being kind of stuck in your ways. Like, this is how I was taught, this is how it was when I was in school, we're gonna sit down and do this work, and that's school.
Yes. But, yes. And you know, in my book, I use the frame of like, that's just the way we do things. That's yeah, how, like, when you hear, and that's what I talk about it throughout the entirety of the book, that when you hear someone say, that's just the way we do things, or that's how we do things here, like that should raise a flag of, wait a second, absolutely, like, why did we create it that way? Why are we doing it that way? And what are our opportunities to evolve the way we do things, so that we are being equitable and inclusive in, you know, the ways in which we're structuring teaching and learning environments.
Especially if you're saying that's the way we always do things. Well, clearly it's not working, because we would be having this conversation if the way we've always done things was correct.
Benefiting everyone. Imagine that, right?
Exactly.
Yes.
So what are some, myths or misconceptions about neurodivergent students that contribute to ableism?
So I think there is a kind of some bias in the expectation that students are not. It hurts me to even say these things out loud. I don't like to give like credit to the falsehoods here. So, but like not intelligent, unintelligent, or can't learn that, or can't be challenged at that level. And so a kind of under provision of opportunities to perform and to excel and to enrich as a function of an expectation being setting a bar low, right? This idea that like, oh well, they are, et cetera, et cetera. And so teaching to a different in a different way, or kind of positioning a child on a different pathway as a function of a stereotype around what that disability classification may mean to that given educator. And then the confluence of content demonstration with like classroom behavior. So when we think about what it means to be a member of a classroom learning community, what good learning looks like, how the student is engaging, and how their behaviors are affirmed or validated, or in other cases, as I talk about in my writing, invalidated, right? And so the ways in which teachers structure those environments, and so they may say, oh well, that's a misbehavior, or that's not a I think about, let me give you an example of something that happened recently. So we let's see, how do I frame this? So students learn their strategies. Many neurodivergent students learn their strategies on how best to kind of access their learning environment. And so, a very common strategy may be to take a movement break, right? Or, there's lots of terminology around that, but this idea of like physical movement or change of pace or walking or breathing in, those like all different ways, right? But to take a break, or to kind of remove oneself, short term, to then be able to re-engage more fully, and or re-engage from the break spot. But when an educator views the taking of a break as you're just trying to get out of doing your work, right? So like, oh, it's because we're in the middle of a test and you're like, I need a break right now, like, and does not validate the student's use of the strategy and recognition that the strategy can help to support the learner to be fully engaged in and like optimize how they will perform in that test or given content, right? It's a disservice to the child. It's a disservice to the student, and it's also very confusing, right? If they're being taught in one setting by we talked about this before, like if you've got the special educator or the support staff or the therapists who are instilling certain strategies or resources of like, here's how to best support you to learn, and then you've got a classroom teacher and or a coach or fill in the blank, right, who maybe isn't fully versed in those and so doesn't understand, and it's like, oh, you're just trying to get out of it. And so it can be very confusing to the child or adolescent on like how best to proceed thereafter.
I can definitely think of so many scenarios from when I was a teacher where teachers would make comments like that, or
Mm-hmm.
they don't need time and a half, or if we do this for this student, then all the other students are gonna want this, and all that kind of stuff. And it's really interesting because it's like, on the one hand there are those lower expectations, but then on the other
Mm-hmm.
hand they're also thinking they're trying to get over on us and they don't need all of this assistance. It's like, well,
Yeah.
what is it that you actually what is it
Yeah.
that you actually
It
think?
and it really, I mean, to me, it comes back to kind of what are our opportunities here to redesign kind of the learning environment, the pedagogies within, to be universally designed, right? And so the
Mhm.
UDL framework is very important and very promising opportunities here, and there's so much strong evidence to suggest that like universally designed settings and environments and pedagogy promote better outcomes for all students. Imagine that, right? All students across the continuum there within. And so, the more that we can begin to think about those ways of supporting schools to structure their classrooms and structure their learning in those ways, the more likelihood we are to have benefits for kids.
Would you happen to have an example of like one of those things that if it's put into place it tends to benefit all the students?
So I'm just gonna like make up a like me use a hypothetical here for a
Okay.
minute. So for example, right, you've got a a classroom structure that's set up where the desks are in rows or the desks are in tables, and they're kind of positioned in a certain way, and the idea here is that like all the kids are supposed to learn sitting at these desks in this given way. And we know that like upwards of some estimates would suggest around the country, right, that like a quarter of the classroom would benefit from a more kind of multi-sensory learning experience by way of their fill in the blank disability classification. And so, you know, if the classroom environment could be structured where there isn't just like three desks that have sensory inputs or alternatives to it, or like, a standing, they stand like a standing desk, let's say, or like a ball chair, something like, but there's like a table, and that's a station in the classroom, and it's any child who's feeling like, let's just call it antsy at the moment, or needing to stand up like I am as I'm dancing around here on your video right now, right? We could just go stand at the desk, and then the child has autonomy and agency in their learning experience, and they're also, it's not just their desk, it's the classroom desk, so anyone could go stand there, right there within. And so it's not a you're being singled out because you are blank blank blank, right, as we were talking about before, this kind of how this label gets used against us, but what are the opportunities to for everyone to get to engage, to support.
That's an awesome example, especially considering how so many people, especially girls, are underdiagnosed. Having those things universally available really helps them as well. And
Yeah.
just people who might do better standing up.
just
Like
just might be
it's
better.
nothing
Just
deeper than
might be
just,
better. Yep,
yeah.
exactly. Exactly.
So, how would you say that this ableism affects students in schools, like academically, socially, mentally? I know we kind of touched on like
Yeah.
academically as far as them not being able to get the full uh,
Yeah.
benefits, but socially and mentally, I want to know more so about.
Yeah, yeah. And so, you can imagine what it would feel like, or what it could feel like, if you are continuously having your expectations and your experiences in a learning environment being invalidated, or being, treated as behaviors when really they are just the way in which you're trying to access learning. And so, the development of learned self helplessness there within. So, academic disidentification, social challenges, anxiety, propensities for depressive symptoms, social exclusion, inability to, maintain or make new friends, the social stigmas that then come with it. It's a spiral. So we can't pinpoint, right, in the literature, that it's any like one given driver, but rather that because the kid, the student, the adolescent, they're in that classroom environment, and they're in that school, and they're kind of having all of these interactions at once. So it's the educator, the school system, their peer groups, and the ways in which they're engaging across. But over time, we do see that when students are invalidated and not affirmed, and being placed in, or more exclusionary placements, being treated as being more behavioral challenges there within, there is this learned self-helplessness, academic disidentification, and these increases in social emotional health symptoms that nobody wants to be experiencing, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I think it's important also to just emphasize that, like, when we're talking about ableism, oftentimes conversations are around like how peers treat their how neurotypical peers treat their
Mm-hmm.
neurodivergent peers.
Mm-hmm.
But in this case, a lot of times it's the well-meaning educators and administrators, it's the adults around who want what's best for their students, who are also keeping these ideas alive.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's something, like, for people who are listening to really realize, like, we spend so much time thinking about like how to make sure that the students aren't getting bullied or that they feel like
Right.
they belong, but the educators play a huge role in making sure that they feel safe with them as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. And they're creating their setting the structure and then continuously socializing
Hmm.
their students and their classrooms through their engagements there within. And so they are, setting the tone for expectations and habits and the ways in which we engage with and treat each other, and the way, what is upheld or valued in that given classroom community. And so, we all, as the adults, who are working with and hopefully learning with our youth, have a role to play in kind of moving that needle forward. I will say that we have, so my team at Yale and our colleagues, we have a federally funded grant that we are just finishing up right now, where we developed something called the Social and Emotional Learning Observation Checklist for elementary schools. And it will be free and publicly available in 2025 and thereafter. And it's an asynchronous training for educators or school leaders or school support staff. And then, a free tool that has identified the discrete pedagogies of social emotional learning. And I can share with you, to share with with your listeners, an article that came out that's also free, that was led by my colleague, Dr. Almut Ziher and colleagues. It came out last year, that's gotten rave reviews. And we identify, what it is in what teachers say and how teachers say it. And we use teacher because in this research and working in 300 classrooms across the country, elementary school classrooms, we, in particular, we were really focusing on the classroom educator as the opportunity to, if we could identify some of the things that maybe are getting said or done that aren't in the best interest of all kids in the class, not because there were bad intentions, but that's because of the way people learn things, right? The way they've been doing it. Then we have an opportunity here to intervene there, to draw the educator's attention to it. And that's what this tool does. So they go through the training, and then it trains you to observe another teacher teaching, to then be able to say, oh, you know what, I heard where you were, invalidating this student's social emotional experience, you were invalidating this group of students in your classroom experience, and here's a small way you can change what you said when it happens again, so that it's validating for everyone. And just like small shifts, with the goal of it being kind of easy and promoting uptake. So I'm happy to share that with you thereafter.
Yes, please do. So the article is already out, but
The
the
article is out. It's a
checklist is not.
theoretical article, and the tool itself with the training will be coming out for the 25-26 school year. So,
Okay.
but I can share you the article, and then, thereafter, folks can follow our lab or follow me, and we'll be sharing that out. It's also will be available through the Department of Education.
Okay, great. Do you know if those educators were receptive to the corrections?
Yes, absolutely. And so what has been fascinating about this this is a multi-year project, and so we kind of started in the thick of virtual learning time and kind of moved through. So it's been
Yeah.
years in the making. Is that not only are the educators receptive, but the leaders and the mental health professionals. We have kind of many schools across the country are wildly diverse. People play lots of different roles, so we have lots of different adults who are kind of involved and touch the program and help us to build it. And they all say when they go through the training, like, I never thought about it that way, or like I never learned that, or I didn't. I heard myself when you said, and we have just all of
Hmm.
these, and it's all real examples. And so everyone who's involved is invested in wanting to learn and grow, because we all, right, we all, myself included, we all have an opportunity to continuously evolve and grow the ways in which we're engaging as educational professionals, and creating safe conditions for all kids. Because our country, our community, our classrooms, our schools are also evolving and changing, right? And so we need
Right.
to continuously evolve with them. And so these are, again, small shifts, with the likelihood of larger rewards in the ways in which we create those cultures in schools.
I'm really happy to hear that they're so receptive.
Yeah.
When we did a webinar a few months ago about addressing challenging behaviors using neurodiversity affirming strategies, and there
Hmm.
were so many attendees, teachers and principals, who were just like, I just didn't know that
Yeah.
this was harmful, or I didn't know
Mm-hmm.
that this was an option. And they showed so much interest in learning a different way. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that's what's super important. Like, yes, there will still be times where they fall short.
All of us
Unfortunately,
do.
it's ingrained in our
Yes.
society.
Yeah.
But that desire and actual action to
Mm-hmm.
become better, to learn, that's what really will make a difference. And hopefully, 10 years from now, these kinds of conversations won't have to happen as often, because more and more people will know how to be more neurodiversity affirming in the way that they
Mm-hmm.
speak and the way that they validate their students, behaviors and feelings and things like that.
Yes,
So
absolutely.
we did touch on this some, but knowing that ableism will probably never be completely absent from schools, what are, I would say, like three steps that schools, or if you want to just focus in on educators, like classroom educators, three steps that they could take to create a more safe and supportive environment for all students?
Great. So I'm gonna shift your question a little bit because I think there's like a couple of key points. So first, we must hold as true, educators and all adults around it, that students vary, learners vary. Variability in learning, thinking, knowing, doing, that is the norm. It is not the exception. And so when we think about the role we play as educators, we have to start from a premise that there is variability in every kid that we meet and engage with, and we have an opportunity to shift how we see our students. And secondly, how we respond to learners varies. And so this gets into that, the dialogue, the bidirectionality that occurs between the interactions of and directions of and the validations of the educator or the adult with the student, and the ways in which we may appraise or uphold certain kind of norms, expectations in our classrooms and in our school settings, on the sports field, right, in the after school, in the dance class, et cetera, right? So it's bidirectional, and so we know we take as a truth that learners vary, and we also hold as a truth that the ways in which we respond to learners vary. And so by working together to think about how we can lean in most effectively to attending to those differences is critical to creating future success. And then the last point I would just say is that if you're interested in affecting change, start with those truths and talk to your students. And when I say talk to, what I really want you to do is open up a space and listen. And listen to learn, which is very different than listening to win. And so a lot of times school systems will set up, different kind of structures in place, but they do kind of fall into the broad bucket of accountability in the ways in which like classroom observations occur, in the ways in which, kids are giving feedback, et cetera. And so we want to encourage all adults to, let down or like not be on the defense in the engagement, and rather like, because our kids, our students, they are brilliant. They will tell you everything. That they will give you all of the recommendations on what could or should or how, right? Or the ways in which they will show you the diversity in how something landed for them versus someone else if given a safe space to share about it. And so, really placing an intention on listening to learn and hearing your students. And then if you have room for that fourth thereafter, quick pick something small that you can do in the short term to show them right away that you heard them, right? There may be lots of big things that come up, but what's kind of a really kind of a, quote unquote quick win that you can, I heard you say this thing, and so I immediately changed, I don't know, this thing up in the classroom or whatever. Like the time between, I did what's the one thing I can change right away? And that's it's an investment in that longer term relationship to say, we're gonna get through all of this, but I'm gonna start with that first one to show you that I heard you, and this was something I could do right now. I could stop saying it this way, et cetera, to kind of move that forward and then continuously engage thereafter.
I really like that idea of that small win, because
Mm-hmm.
sometimes we, just as people, get caught up in like planning to change and planning to
Oh my
implement
goodness,
these
yes.
things and just like planning all this stuff instead of just saying,
Yes.
okay, I'm gonna do this today. Like I'm gonna
Yes.
start taking steps today instead of planning when I'm gonna start taking steps. So
Yes.
I really
Yes.
like that you made that point. And you talked about the SEL sheet that will be coming out in
Mm-hmm.
2025, but how important is SEL to neurodivergent students and addressing this ableism in the classroom and all of that?
I mean, we could talk for another hour about that question, but my short answer here is that social emotional learning underscores our opportunities to be available to learn and access our academic content and then some. It underscores the relationships and the opportunities to form and maintain healthy relationships. It underscores the ways in which we think about making choices, the choices that we make, and the ways in which we understand and interpret how we have then, made a healthy or productive or maybe not so healthy or productive choice thereafter. So the decision making functions therein, and of course the executive functionings, the goal settings, and our opportunities to kind of succeed in quote unquote school, right? And so it's there, it underscores it all, and the more that we can provide students, all students, with healthy skills and strategies to support them navigating the complexities of the school system and across life, the more that we can support educators with growing in their social emotional competence so that they have the skills and strategies to navigate those complexities. And as I said earlier, in our call, just allow them to enable them to see their students as they are, right, as opposed to kind of all of the biases that may come into play in terms of who they may think they might be or should be. And so social emotional learning is that key in there. And unfortunately, it's gotten not so good of a rap over the past couple of years and then some, depending upon what pockets and spaces you're in the country. And I'm the first to tell you, as a scientist, that there's definitely some room for improvement there too. And so our literature and our work within the social emotional learning space is really to evolve the practices and pedagogies there within to be equitable and inclusive of all students, neurodivergent students being right up there in that continuum there within. But it is only through evolving social emotional learning and having it be a foundation in school systems that we will truly realize and actualize safe, inclusive spaces for neurodivergent students and all of their peers.
Yeah, it does sound like we could have a whole nother episode strictly about that. So I might
Yes.
be emailing you again to
All
get you
right.
back
Yeah,
on here.
absolutely.
Um, but yes, thank you. And being in the South, I definitely know about the different opinions
Mm-hmm.
of SEL, but I
Mm-hmm.
wholeheartedly agree that it's just such an important part of the student experience. And I love that you touched on how the educators need that as well,
Mm-hmm.
because, they they're also navigating their own challenges, and so it's hard to pour from an empty cup. And if you don't know how to, you know regulate your own emotions, replenish yourself, be self-aware,
Mm-hmm.
have those build those relationships, then how can you help
Yeah.
your students do so as well?
Mm-hmm.
So I love that you talked about it from those different angles. And last thing, I'm going to let you go. Where can people go to connect with you and stay updated on what you're doing?
Absolutely. So my lab at Yale is called the Education Collaboratory. So it's like educationcollaboratory.org, but I can also give you, it's a kind of a long spelling, so you can access us there. And my professional website is drchriscip.com, and within drchriscip.com you also can subscribe to learn more about my book and the science that we have coming out and on opportunities to engage with us. I am accessible on LinkedIn and across social media, and regularly disseminate our science. One important note I want to make is that everything that I and my team does, from a science standpoint, is free and publicly available. So we are publicly engaged scholars. And so if you find something or see something or heard me say something, you're like, ooh, I want to access that, and you're hitting a paywall, like, please let me be your first email, because all we want is to make sure that folks have the resources at their disposal to make their informed decisions about the ways in which they're going to engage moving forward. So I'll drop a couple of links for you to share alongside this interview.
That's awesome. I definitely will. And for those who are just listening, can you spell your website?
Yeah, so drchriscip.com.
Okay.
So drchriscip.com.
Thank you so very much. I truly enjoyed this conversation with you. We could go
Thank
on
you.
and on and on. I know we could, but
I
you have to
absolutely.
get back to doing very
Yeah.
important things at Yale. So
Thank
thank
you
you
so much
so
for the
much.
opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Christina, and we'll chat again soon.
I look forward to it. Take
All
care.
right. You too.